Welcome back. I hope you're all not feeling too lethargic, because the last thing I want is you falling asleep during my bit, which is now. So I'm going to talk about my favourite subject, me. This is, I'm Lisa Mead. I'm the actual Emergency Department Software Support Manager for Heart of England, NHS Trust, and I work down in ED. But I think it's really important for me to talk about transitioning at work. You need to understand my history. Okay, so I'm going to go through my, yes, it will work, right. I'm going to talk about my background initially, where I was born in at Stuart Mead. And I had an uneventful education despite my dyslexia, and left after completing my GCSEs. I moved on from there and went into the RAF, as I mentioned, in 1990 as an aerospace systems operator. Now, that sounds a lot posher than it actually is. I was just a fighter controller's assistant, so I used to help the man telling the pilots where to go. I left the RAF in 2002 and moved into the IT sector. What a journey that was. And yes, the saying, switch it off and switch it on again, is used quite frequently. This was me in my previous version. And unlike a lot of the transgender community, I'm quite proud of the journey I am going through. And I have no shame in saying this was me. As you can see, it's quite a significant change.
Did you keep the shoes though?
Yeah. No, they went years ago.
What size were they?
10.
I'm a 10.
After leaving the RAF and working a few years in IT, I came out as transgender to a friend of mine at Hewlett-Packard. So that was quite an interesting conversation, something I had really struggled to work up to. I then, after several different contracts and working all over the West Midlands, I started here at Heart of England NHS Foundation Trust in early 2014 as an agency worker. And I've now progressed into a substantive role doing software management. So what difficulties have I experienced in my transition? Throughout a transgender's individual life story, one of the things they really struggle with is their physical identity. The fact that every time you wake up in the morning, there's aspects of your body that you're not happy with. And for a lot of the community, they need to deal with that in some way. But the personal battle's not just about your inner, how you perceive yourself physically. It's also how you perceive yourself inwardly and how others perceive you as well. In my early years, when I was 10, never even heard of transgender identities. That caused a lot of issues, and I went through life pretending to be something that I never identified as, something I never even acknowledged myself, which resulted for me in joining the RAF. I thought, well, I'm physically got bits I don't want, but I'm going to have to express that. And I ended up joining a very male-dominated arena, the RAF, which I hoped would enforce discipline and help me deal with my inner demons, as I put it. My family, very supportive, I have to say, and it's, I won't say unique, but it is getting more and more accepted within family relationships about transgender issues. My mum, to this day, says, "I knew you were trans." Bless her little cotton socks. So when I told her back in 2014 that I was transitioning, going full time, she was like, "Yeah, whatever." Bless her little cotton socks. However, my sister had a little bit of issue with telling my nieces and my nephews and niece. They were going through school at the time. She didn't want them to tell everybody at school that they had a trans uncle, auntie, whichever it is. And she didn't want them to experience the issues with that. However, when I started my full-time transition, that changed overnight. And my sister told my niece and my two nephews, almost to the day when I told her that I was transitioning, explained it to them, and for the first time I was invited down to my sister's house with her family, and I was invited as Lisa, which made a huge difference to me. Social barriers, this is a huge one. Every time I come to work, every time I step out that front door, I feel anxious. I don't know how people are going to react to me. I don't know whether I'm going to get shouted out from across the road. "Oh, are you a bloke?" And it does happen a lot. One example I will give you is, went out with some friends who were really supportive and encouraged me to come out as Lisa. Went out on a social night out with this group of friends. We were in a straight pub. I went to the ladies' bathroom, as one would, and came out, and on my way outside for a breath of fresh air, I was challenged by a young lady who was asking me, "Have you still got your man bits?" And I was like, "I don't even know you. Why are you asking that?" So I just said, "I don't think it's any of your business." To which she replied, "Of course it is, you're just in the ladies' toilets." And I said, "Well, yeah, of course I am. I wouldn't feel safe going into the men's toilets the way I am, especially considering you're now talking to me the way you are." At which point, she was getting a little bit disturbed at the fact that I wasn't actually telling her stuff. And she decided to put a hand up my skirt.
Sorry, I'm not laughing.
No, it's fine, it's fine. To which my reply was quite simple. "You better go wash your hands now. Yeah, wash that STI off." Or at least I wish that was my reply that I hadn't thought of 2 hours later. So what about work and fears? Well, all of those social barriers do cause fears within the workplace or coming out at work. If people I don't know can react to me in that way, what about people I do know? There's fears over whether your employer is going to keep you, whether your employer is going to give you a hard time. Through the transitioning period, if a trans individual decides to go for gender reassignment surgery, that requires a certain amount of time off to recuperate. A lot of organisations see that surgery as cosmetic and won't give you the sick leave. They won't give you the time off. So you end up having to take it as annual leave. Now, I don't know about most of you, but you don't get 6 weeks annual leave. They're just a few snippets of what some of the barriers and the fears of work are. There's endless I could go into, and I haven't got time for that. So what about transitioning at work? The organisation is key in a transition to work. I didn't start my real life experience living full-time as Lisa until I found Heft. Heart of England Foundation Trust is a place that, even though I started as an agency worker on a contract that could have been binned off at any time, I felt safe here. I felt supported. I felt happy that if somebody wanted to talk to me about something, I was prepared to actually tell them because I knew they wouldn't ridicule me. A lot of that also stems around some of the work we've done here at Heart of England around the transgender policy that we're bringing in. This tells the staff, gives them a set of rules, a direction on how we should be treated. Policies and procedures also apply to our patients here as well. So our transgender policy covers staff, patients and visitors. And one of the questions somebody came up with earlier was, if I can remember this correctly, it mentioned the ED department and what happens when a transitioning individual comes into the emergency department. Our policy tries to stipulate that it should be dignified. Once we identify that patient as trans, we will take that patient to one side. We will ask them the registration questions in a private setting so we don't have to out them in our reception areas. It's little things like that that make a difference to the community. Workplace relationships are also key. If my management or my co-workers, when I first started here at Heft, hadn't been intrigued by me telling them this stuff, they hadn't been questioning over how I was going, they wouldn't have learnt. They didn't understand in the first place about anything about it. I personally, as a transgender individual, am prepared to talk to anybody that asks me appropriate, significant questions. What's not appropriate is other people talking to other people without my involvement, those questions. So, transitioning, how would that affect my relationship with everybody at work? How would that affect my relationship with the management and the higher organisation, HR? Loads of things to go into there. My management at the time were absolutely fantastic. And I wouldn't be here speaking to you now if they hadn't been, to be honest with you. Every stage, from me being Stuart, right the way through to me standing here for you today, management have asked me, would you mind? Can you do? Simple questions. The actual day that I transitioned, I think it was a day or two before, but you know, here and there, an email was sent out to all of my work colleagues. And we've actually used that email in an example to help some of the other staff within the trust. Explaining that Stuart is no longer to be known as Stuart. From this day forward, she is Lisa. And it is such a well-worded email. And it had my involvement throughout the entire creation of that email. So I knew everything that was going out. And through that, the next day when I turned up at work, I was greeted with hugs. I was greeted with congratulations. Thank you, you're so brave. Comments I still get today. Documentation is another huge issue within any organisation. When you change your name, there's huge issues around HR. You've got to have your right, they want to see change of name documentation. They want to see, you've got to inform the tax office. You've got to change your driving licence, your passport. It's a huge, huge journey with a lot of professional bodies needing involvement. One of those is the work environment. So, working in a healthcare environment, DBS checks. People don't realise that as a transgender individual, if I was to be outed through a DBS check, they're actually breaking the law. So the government have come up with a process where DBS checks I can apply through work as my existing name, but I then have to phone the DBS check service and let them know that a check in that name is coming up, and they're to do all relevant checks against my old name as well, which then gets appended on, which they also changed the name. So documentation is quite a significant part of anybody's transition at work as well. And I've put other considerations there, but do you know what? I think I've covered them all. Just catching up on my slide. Hang on a second. Oh, yes. Now I'd like to show you a quick video. I'm glad Gary was here. This was actually created or commissioned by Leicester Police in association with the National LGBT Police Network.
Trans basically is short for transgender, and transgender means anyone who doesn't entirely identify with the gender they were assigned at birth. Trans women are basically people who are assigned male at birth and identify as women and express themselves as women, and they are women.
A trans male is the opposite. It's somebody who was assigned female at birth and has transitioned into being male.
So non-binary is where you don't identify as either male or female. It's where you identify as either being fluid or neither.
Pronouns are important because it's our way of identifying with the world. It's the way the world shows that they respect who your identity is and that they are aware of it.
If possible, ask somebody their preferred pronouns. They, them would work really well if you're not sure.
Gender identity is about how you identify as a person inside, and that's quite different to gender expression, which is how you portray yourself to the rest of the world.
I was born and everyone saw my physical traits and they said, okay, it's a boy. And I can understand that. Of course they would jump to that conclusion. It's statistically probable that I would have been a boy. It turns out I wasn't. I can't explain why my genetics were the way they were. I just know how I've always felt.
Not all trans people have surgery, but that doesn't make them any more or less of a trans person than somebody who has taken steps to have surgery. And there are many reasons why people may opt not to have any surgeries. That might be because they don't feel they need it. It might be because they're scared of operations or maybe considered too old or have health issues that preclude them from it. Transitioning in the workplace shouldn't be a big deal. It's really not a complex process at all. We just need to make sure that when somebody's going through the transition, which could take anything from 2 years to 5 years plus, that they feel included and supported at work. So that's going to be a range of different things, talking about how we refer to them, what facilities they use, making sure that the team that they work in have some trans awareness. But ultimately, it's important to remember that under the Equality Act 2010, all organisations have a responsibility to make sure trans people are included at work and don't face discrimination.
I've been nervous that I wouldn't get certain jobs. I thought maybe I would be judged by my appearance. One of the reasons I haven't always brought it up is because I feel that my gender is just one small part of myself.
People generally understood that actually what was important was doing the job. Me as a person wasn't in myself changing, I was just being who I always have been. The misconceptions that people still took on board were that Friday would be perceived or would be one gender, and on Monday it would come back as a new gender. I could define my transition as happening over a 2 to 3 year period, but it's such a transitional, gradual event.
When Isla arrived with us, it was a total change of what we were expecting. We're worried in a workplace not to upset anyone and say the wrong thing. From, I think, day one, it was a breath of fresh air, really.
If you know somebody is transgender because they've told you or you've heard about it, it's really important that you're careful about not outing them to anybody else. There are a couple of laws that pertain to this. The Gender Recognition Act 2004, it's actually a criminal offence in a professional capacity to tell somebody that somebody else is transgender. And also the Equality Act 2010 ensures that we don't harass, discriminate or victimise somebody because they are trans. Some people transition and just want to live their life as quietly as anybody else in the gender that they know themselves to be. So by outing somebody, you could put a serious risk to their mental health, physical health, and it might lead to something really, really serious.
There's definitely been times when I've been outed, against my will. I know I'm very out and proud and happy to talk about being trans, but it's still wrong to do that. The power of that should be in the individual, never by those around them.
As colleagues, we should be really mindful about showing respect to trans people. So, for example, just because somebody might have a deep voice doesn't mean that they're automatically going to identify as male. So if somebody says they are a miss or a missus, even though they might sound like what you think is a man, it's important to respect the fact that they've told you that they are in fact female.
If somebody shares what their preference is, they're trusting you. If you make a mistake, it's fine. Just try not to do it again.
Even though you might not have anybody at work who's openly transgender, it's really important to remember that you don't know that they might be in the closet about being trans, or they might have somebody in their family or one of their friends that is trans. You might be having what you think is an innocuous chat around the water cooler about a trans celebrity that you've seen in the press, and you might say something that we consider offensive but don't realise you've said it. So it's really important to understand about trans terminology, about trans people's feelings, just as you would with somebody from a BAME background or from a disabled background.
You don't know who's around or who you're affecting. My brother would go to work, for example, and people didn't know that he had a transgender sister, and he would suffer the same comments or jokes in general society and suffer the same for them. When you raise a conversation about being trans, that certainly in the workplace, the toilet conversation always comes up. You can pre-plan for all of this. It shouldn't be beholden on the trans individual to make that happen. It can happen before you have someone trans working for you, so that you're already prepared. Gender-neutral facilities are really easy to implement.
There has to be a line in the sand drawn at some particular point in a transition where we allow somebody to use the facilities for the gender they identify with, and that should be done in agreement with line manager and the person themselves. It's important to say that once somebody has reached that decision, that the organisation supports them and takes steps against anybody who chooses to challenge that process, and that could be in a disciplinary, it could be in a supervisionary conversation, something like this. But it's really important that we address anybody who says that somebody shouldn't be using a facility that's been agreed that they can use.
Don't make a trans person, once they've come out to you, have to only use a disabled toilet. They're the kind of things that really it creates some form of stigma for people who need to use a disabled toilet anyway, but also for the trans person, because it's they're not being allowed to use the facilities according to their gender. Clothing that they say that they prefer should be given to them, certainly in the workplace. There can be flexibility on behalf of the person, but there definitely has to be flexibility on behalf of the organisation to really show that those staff members are valued and they are included.
So in West Midlands Police, in custody, we have very gendered uniforms, and the men wear clip-on ties and the girls wear cravats. And no questions were asked at all. I was sent to uniform stores. I was quite anxious. I was like, oh no, what if they send me to the female uniform stores, even though I applied as Dylan and male? They didn't. They sent me straight to the male uniform stores, and I got my tie and I got my male uniform, and it was brilliant. No questions were asked.
So at the restaurant, we're working on changing our public bathrooms to non-identified, and I think that's really important so that you don't feel like people are judging you. I've had security follow me into toilets. That's the kind of thing that can scar you. You may not realise it, but years later it can still cause an effect. I know people who don't even use the bathroom in public spaces. They'll wait the whole day until they get home because they're nervous of having some kind of judgment.
If you're a woman, you're entitled to use the women's loos, and if you're a man, you're entitled to use the men's loos. Doesn't matter how far along in your transition you are. We're going to look back and think that gendered toilets were a ridiculous idea.
Since Brexit, it's fair to say that we've seen an increase in hate crimes across a lot of minority communities. We want to make sure that LGBT people feel safe in reporting those crimes to the police and can actually see that things are getting done when they do report. Hate crime can take many forms, and even things like being shouted at, being spat at. We'd encourage trans people to report these because although they might seem like it's not a big deal and there are more important crimes to solve, it builds up a pattern of intelligence should something more serious happen.
Don't have any preconceived ideas of what a person might be like, might not be like. Just, it's a person. I'm sure there'd be lots of questions that you'd have. Ask those questions. That person would be only too pleased to tell you as much as they're comfortable with about themselves, about the journey they've had to get to where they are at the moment.
Right, so as you can imagine, I hope you've learned a little bit from that video. Okay, so I just want to briefly summarise about work and myself. So I started discussion with my line manager quite early on in my contract within Heft, while I was contracting for the ED department, at which point, while I was contracting for the IT department, too many acronyms, and I used to be in the RAF. The management have been extremely supportive. I then moved into the emergency department, where I changed from agency to bank staff, and I've now changed from bank staff to a fully substantive role. We talked about DBS checks, and a trans individual has to go through this extra step that most people don't get visibility of. And I've talked about a whole load of other HR stuff, like changing your tax, things like this, but something not everybody realises. But when you change your tax code, when you change your identity, in some cases, if not a good majority of them, when you're changing when you change your identity as well, your national insurance number gets put in a protected status, which means it can be difficult for things like cross-reference checks, credit checks, all sorts of things like that. It makes people difficult to find you. We're just losing your national insurance number. The only other group of people that lose their or get their national insurance number put on protected status are ex-criminals, people going through probation. So, after all the support I had, I decided it was time to give back to Heft everything I can. So I joined the LGBT network group, and with UHB's input, sourcing their document and such like. We've gone through it and we're working together to finalise this, and it's coming out very soon, I believe, if not already. I think it's implemented at UHB. We also did a role model campaign, which is something I'm very proud of. It covered BME, disability, trans, LGBT. That role model campaign actually had quite a huge impact. And all we did was put a few stories from staff from different backgrounds, posted them up in prominent places within the trust, and rotating 3 or 4 stories every week around all 3 hospitals. That's had a huge impact, and in fact within the first week I believe we had 2 members of staff contacting Sally and saying, thank you, that Lisa's made a big impact in my life and I've come out to my line manager. Little things like that along the way make a huge difference. Something else on the role model campaign. NHS employees have now taken up that role model campaign and done a case study on it, which they have now published as of yesterday. So if you want to read a little bit more about my story, I am actually featured in that one as well. And as for the future, well, who knows? All I can say is my story continues. So I know I've overrun by a minute or 2.
No.
5 minutes. 10? No! I started 10 minutes late. Yeah. It's because it's all about me. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I've not got time for questions, but however, thank you very much.